This is a true story. On April 6, 1994, two of the best divers in the world, after a year of rigorous training, were ready to break a new world record. Finally, they arrived at the world's deepest underwater sinkhole and began their dive. However, a few hours later, something unexpected happened. At 9:45 a.m., the two divers, led by Sheck, disappeared into the river. Sheck and Burden did not dive together along the same guideline, but dived along separate lines. In order to avoid contact and interference, they set up two lines. At a depth of 191 meters, they stopped breathing compressed air and switched to Henry gas. They began the real dive and switched to standard ratio air again at a depth of 180 meters. They continued to dive at 33 meters per minute, planning to slow down at 240 meters. Eventually, Sheck reached 240 meters and Burden reached 230 meters. They began to slow down, but Burden, who was at the shallow end, encountered an unexpected problem. The previous dive speed was much faster than planned, causing him to consume more helium than expected. When he realized the problem, he began to feel itching and tingling in his body. Hundreds of flashing lights even appeared in front of his eyes, and his vision became blurred. As a professional diver, he immediately realized that the symptoms of high-pressure neurosis were emerging. If the symptoms worsened, his life would be in danger. Obviously, the deeper he dived, the more serious the symptoms would be. He had to give up the dive. When he was hesitating whether to give up, he saw Sheck diving silently. Burden was unwilling to give up and decided to continue diving. When he continued to dive to 275 meters, he checked the air pressure gauge and was shocked. The amount of gas he consumed was not in line with the plan. Normally, this would not cause serious problems, but this time it was different. One of the two cylinders he carried was exhausted, and the other was only half empty. This was a serious problem. Continuing the dive was almost equivalent to giving up his life. In the end, he decided to stop at a depth of 280 meters and start ascending. He accelerated his ascent with the help of a buoyancy device until he stopped at a depth of 140 meters and began to replace the cylinder on his back with a spare cylinder on the guideline. When he reached that position, the cylinder on his back was completely exhausted, so he had to quickly replace the cylinder and put the regulator in his mouth. However, when he opened the cylinder valve, the amount of gas sprayed out was too large. The regulator was blown out of his mouth. The regulator flew out of the mouth and swayed violently in the water, emitting gas. Burden calmly tried to fix the regulator. If he couldn't fix it, he would be in danger of drowning. However, despite trying for a long time, he couldn't fix the regulator, so he came up with a solution. He clamped the air tank to his waist, held his breath and ascended, opening the valve only when he needed to breathe. This method did work. He could continue to breathe, but in the case of high-pressure neurological syndrome, his body was under great pressure. In addition, he had to stop at 40 meters and 90 meters for decompression. However, for him this was the best option. He endured the discomfort and finally reached a depth of 90 meters. There he replaced the air tank with a normal regulator. After no major problems, he breathed a sigh of relief and looked in the direction of Sheck. Meanwhile, on the surface of Zacatón, the support team was monitoring the bubbles of Burden and Sheck. After 10 minutes of diving, bubbles appeared on the surface of the water where Sheck and Burden were. According to their calculations, bubbles should be seen again in 15 minutes. However, bubbles only appeared where Burden was. Since Sheck was obviously below Burden, they decided to wait for a while. However, as time went by, Sheck's bubbles never appeared. A diver from the support team decided to dive and meet with Burden to learn about the situation. At the same time, Burden found that Sheck's guideline did not move. His intuition told him that Sheck might be dead or had a serious problem. After and dived, she met Burden at a depth of 20 meters and asked about Sheck's situation. At this time, they still held the hope that Sheck was still alive, so and decided to continue diving to find Sheck. When he dived to 80 meters according to the time calculation, Sheck should stop there for decompression. But he didn't even see Sheck's light. Although he wanted to continue diving, he had to decide to ascend due to lack of air. And Burden stopped at a depth of 20 meters for decompression. Several support divers also came down to meet them. At this time, they all realized that Sheck might have died, and gradually accepted this fact during the communication. Later, Burden completed the long and lonely decompression process alone and finally surfaced. The news of Sheck's death spread quickly, and the crowd at the scene was in turmoil because no one believed that this world-class diver would never come back. Then they began to salvage Sheck's body. However, there was no safe way to reach Sheck's depth, so they decided to abandon the search and began to evacuate, collecting the equipment that Zacatón had used. Finally, they began to pull up the guideline that Zacatón had used for the dive. Burden's line came up easily, But Sheck's line was very heavy with unused cylinders, so it was difficult to pull up. When they had almost pulled all the lines up, they found Sheck's body tied to the end of the line. Sheck realized that he was about to die underwater, and he didn't want to risk others trying to salvage his body, so he tied his body to the guideline. The cause of Sheck's death is still unknown, but it is certain that he suffered from a high-pressure nervous syndrome. However, considering that he had experienced this syndrome many times without any consequences, the syndrome itself may not have been fatal. It is more likely that he had a muscle spasm during the attack, which prevented him from biting his breathing regulator, and a series of accidents occurred, and he eventually drowned. Another less likely possibility is that the gas ratio in the gas mixture was wrong. If the proportion of oxygen was too high, it would cause poisoning, and if the proportion of nitrogen was too high, it would cause a drunk bomb. It is unlikely that someone as meticulous as Sheck would make such a mistake. After Sheck's body was recovered, Burden became the first diver in the world to reach a depth of 282 meters, the length of a football field. This achievement was Sheck's goal until his death. Sheck was dedicated to diver safety and received numerous accolades from the diving community. He was buried in Jacksonville, Florida, next to his brother. Although no diver has yet broken Burden's record at Zacatón since the accident, divers have broken the depth record elsewhere. To this day, the diving community still believes that these records would not have been achieved without Sheck Exley's efforts.